2 years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the conflict is giving all appearances of turning into a forever war. But in other parts of the world, Russia's influence has arguably grown. This week on What Matters Now, former MK Ksenia Svetlova, an expert in the Middle East and Russia, speaks with me, Amanda Borschel-Dan, about how Russia's forces remain throughout the Middle East and how its reach has deepened in Africa. Born in Moscow, Svetlova immigrated to Israel at the age of 14. She's a journalist and analyst and was a member of the 20th Knesset on behalf of the Zionist Union coalition. She shares how Russian citizens are faring after 2 years of Western sanctions, and how, unlike most Western countries, Russia sees Hamas as a legitimate political player on the global stage. Next week, Moscow is potentially set to host a peace summit in the hopes of reconciliation between the terrorist rulers of Gaza and the leadership of the West Bank's Palestinian Authority. Why? So this week, after 2 years of war in Ukraine, we ask Ksenia Svetlova, what matters now? Ksenia, thank you so much for joining me here in the Times of Israel's Jerusalem office.
Thank you for having me.
We are speaking at the eve of the second year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was, of course, on February 24th, 2022. So because I've been paying attention to our own Israel-Hamas war, I actually don't know what's happening right now in Ukraine. I guess I shouldn't admit that, but I'm admitting it. So please, can you just start by giving me a sense of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine now?
Yeah, so actually a lot of happening, and precisely during the last week, Russians had some tactical victory over the Ukrainians, pushing them from one of the, I would say, settlements, villages of Donetsk area, Avdiivka. But it was it's not very strategic, but yet important, because this is the first township that the Russians are able to take during the long time, so... the Ukrainians explain their advance due to the lack of military equipment. They are working with very little from what they still have from the American aid. They are looking, of course, and hoping that the package will pass it passed in the Senate, and it will pass also in the Congress, but it will still take a lot of time, even if it will. And there is, of course, uncertainty about that. So Russians are making some small advances. Of course, Amanda, when you compare it to the promises of Putin to take Kiev in 3 days, and then after 2 years, they are proud of taking some not exactly strategical small township in Donetsk area. This is, of course, cannot be labeled as success. But of course, in the internal debate in Russia, this is something that makes them feel more optimistic about the advance, and also about the lack of support for Ukraine in the US and Europe and so on. So basically, they're building on that. Another significant event that took place just like recently, this is a success in the Black Sea of the Ukrainian Navy. Something that, frankly, if you would ask me a couple of years ago, what do I think about Ukrainian Navy, I would tell you, does it really exist?
What Navy?
What Navy? But apparently, not only do they have the upper hand in the Black Sea over the Russians, they were able to sink another military ship. And the Russians are right now, their Navy is located not even in the Black Sea, not even in Crimea. I mean, it's like 200 miles from the shores of Ukraine. And this is a little comforting news for those who support Ukraine, of course. Advances in the military, in the Navy, less success right now in the battlefields. But also Russians are tired. They have this battle fatigue. They are fighting with new recruits that basically do not know how to fight, because they lost their first army during the first year of the battles with Ukrainians. And also they have problem with shipments of military supplies, because they waste more supplies than they are able to produce.
It sounds to me that the number one success right now of Ukraine is that the war is still going on at all, in that the Ukrainian army didn't crumble within these 3 days or 3 months or even the first year or the second year. But obviously, Russia has a lot more manpower to draw from. So how is Ukraine going to counter that?
So this is the big question, of course. And we saw a lot of realignment inside the structure of the Ukrainian army, the change, of course, of the commander-in-chief, very significant from the very revered figure, the father of the soldiers, to a new personage who, so the rumor says, has more of a kind of a strict attitude, and he's also Russian by nationality, which is interesting. We also saw last year already the resignation of the Ministry of Defense, Alexei Reznikov, who was just recently a guest of ANO Museum here in Tel Aviv, and gave a very interesting speech about what is happening right now in Ukraine. So Zelensky is trying to bring in new blood, new figures, trying to reignite, of course, the vigor to fight. It is very difficult, of course, because of the corruption stories, because of the nepotism stories, the ability of some of Ukraine to buy off their freedom and not to go to the battlefield, and while others are recruited, of course, from 18 to 60. It's still the case. But of course, the question number one is the support of the West. The Ukrainians still want to fight. They didn't give up. They don't have this luxury. And in this sense, Reznikov, in this speech that I was present there, I was actually one of the speakers at the event. He said that just like Israelis, Ukrainians do not have any other place to go. The Russians simply don't want them to be as a nation, as a state. And here he drew a lot of similar lines to our situation here in Israel.
Would he go so far as to claim genocide on behalf of the Russians, that the Russians are trying to exterminate the Ukrainian people in general?
Yes. The word genocide came up during this conversation, during his statement. And this is something that, well, unfortunately, the world kind of got used that Russia is pounding residential quarters in Kiev, in Odessa, in Kharkiv, and in other places. They're actually doing less so in the recent weeks, but only because they are lacking the military supplies, not for any other reason, and that they're extorting this death toll from the civilian population, basically on a daily basis. But the Ukrainians, when they combine this situation with the statements of Russian officials, they say that Ukraine should cease to exist. Ukraine, maybe there should be some pocket in the West that can be annexed by Poland or something like this, but they say that there is no Ukrainian nation, there are no Ukrainians per se. And in this regard, again, there is this very strong feeling of identification with the struggle of Israel right now against everybody who believes that there is no room for Israel here, and the Israeli nation should stop to exist.
What do you hear from the Jewish communities in Ukraine? It was quite a massive population prior to the war. What are you hearing now?
Well, it's a tragedy because the communities, thriving communities that were also very successful, also as in uniting this Jewish sense of belonging, but also economically. And they no longer exist. Many of these communities stopped to exist. They dispersed, some to Israel, some to Europe. Members of one community went to different places. And again, the Jews still live in Ukraine. There are many Jews who are there, and many Jews fight in the ranks of the Ukrainian army. But nevertheless, this is a huge blow to the Jewish presence in Ukraine. The war is still ongoing. It's very difficult. In Israel, we sometimes complain that there is not enough air flights out of Israel, and there is not much competition as it used to be. Well, there are no flights for 2 years right now from Ukraine. You simply cannot fly out. You can, of course, go through Poland or some other country, but they are cut off. And this, of course, influences everything. And as for the Jews, well, when there will be peace. The chief rabbi of Ukraine says people will be back, but it remains to be seen when the war will stop.
Prior to the war with Hamas, Ukraine was definitely much more in the headlines, and I'm sure Ukrainians and the Ukrainian leadership is feeling that. And I wonder how they're feeling. Again, you alluded to the idea of supplies and funding from the United States, but delve into that a little bit more, specifically surrounding the upcoming U.S. elections.
The Ukrainians understand, of course, that after 2 years, the focus on Ukraine, it's not the same as it used to be in the beginning. And it's clear why. The focus of the international attention is diffused. There is a lot of going on, and there is not only Israel, elections all over the world. So it seems the murder of Alexei Navalny in prison, other events and so on. But at the same time, they were able to create partnerships all across the NATO bloc, European countries, the US, of course, and other countries as well who are also members of NATO and so on. And this cooperation, this is what's important, not only the ongoing concentration and focus and media attention to Ukraine, this is important too, but the resilience of these bonds, of these ties. So right now, despite the very gruesome situation in the US, when, the Congress is blocking the aid to Ukraine and also to Israel, the Ukrainians still feel that they have a friend in the White House, and they wonder whether they will have still a friend after the November elections due to notorious Donald Trump's statements just last week about whoever doesn't want to pay to NATO, I will say to Putin, you can do whatever you want with them. Clearly indication on European countries. And in general, his trend for isolationism and getting the US further away from treating these international issues and being involved in them, ending the forever wars. Didn't start with Trump. It was also Biden and Obama.
You mentioned the idea of the forever war, and we're 2 years on in Ukraine, and we're now talking about really slight advancements on the side of the Russians, and it just sounds like we're in that model right now in the Ukraine war. Would you agree with that?
As for the Ukrainians, it really depends on what will be happening in the US in regards to the aid package to Ukraine, also the European Union, of course, and whether the Ukrainians will be able to regain the strength that they need to start the counteroffensive in 2025. So yes, we are looking at least a couple of years of war more, and none of the sides seems to be willing to stop it, so there is still no chance for some kind of solution there. But it doesn't mean, however, that this static situation, it will be present forever. It can change. Again, much depends on the countries who believe that Ukraine, it's the last frontier. And if Ukraine will fall, then Poland can be next, or Lithuania could be next. And then basically Russia can get its way and have this domination in the European plane. And how will it do good to the global order, to the, Western bloc, to NATO, and all of that. A lot of depends on the West, not only on the resilience of Ukrainians and their personal bravery, which they do not lack.
Let's turn our focus to another part of the global alignments in terms of Russia. And let's talk about a potential upcoming summit next week on the 26th, in which Moscow may host the Palestinian Authority and Hamas for a peace summit. What do you know about this?
Well, first of all, it's already a second such event. They had already one, I think, a couple of years ago when they summoned all of the Palestinian factions, not only Fatah and Hamas, but also others, members of the PLO. There are 13 organizations, as well as others who do not belong to the PLO, obviously Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. So the idea behind it, of course, it's to demonstrate the ability, the Russian diplomatic ability, the Russian diplomatic muscle. If you want, they can do something that other countries are unable to, because they do not recognize Hamas or believe that it's a terrorist organization. Well, Russia can do it, but the question is, what kind of leverage does it have on the actors in actually achieving the goal of the Palestinian unity, something that the Arab countries or United States or other countries were not able to achieve in 17 years of the basically civil war between different parts of the Palestinian autonomy ruled by Fatah and Hamas. Last time that they met in Moscow, they went just like as they came, with the same status, unwilling to do any advances, to do some kind of compromise and so on. So it seems that also now they are very far away from each other. We see that Hamas perhaps is today a little bit more flexible, and they are willing maybe to compromise a little bit more to be accepted into the PLO. But the one who is reluctant about it is Abu Mazen, is Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the PA, who just last week, maybe prior to this meeting in Moscow, outlined his demands. So the Hamas has to recognize the PLO and agreements that were signed by PLO, meaning the Oslo Accords. This is the basic difference between the parties. Hamas is not about to recognize it. If they would be able to do it, they would do it long time ago and save all of this misery through all of these years. But this is something that is very ideological. I personally do not believe that Russia will be able to bridge the gap.
Do you expect that the summit will actually take place?
Well, I think that why not? Although the last time Abu Mazen, when he was invited to Russia, he declined to visit there. It was already in the midst of the war. And it was kind of a subtle protest against the invitation of Hamas, who had this privilege to be invited the first in Moscow, and they visited there during the first month of the war, 1 month into the atrocities, something that, of course, enraged Israelis, but it also enraged people in Ramallah who believe that they have the authority, they are the recognized body that represents the Palestinian, not the Hamas. So we'll see about that. For now, I think it's early to tell, but I didn't see that any of the parties declined this invitation. So we will see about that next week.
When we're talking about Hamas attending, who do you expect to attend from Hamas?
Well, I think that the Russians would be wary, of course, to invite somebody from the military wing and from the internal Gazan leadership. It's also not feasible because that they are in hiding. And there is a question about whether they are still in Gaza or perhaps somewhere else. But there could be, of course, Musa Abu Marzouk. He is the traditional figure. He was once a deputy of the Politburo of Hamas, deputy of Khaled Mashal at the time. So he usually leads these delegations. Probably Khalil El-Haya, one of the also political leadership of the outside Hamas abroad. We'll see about Ismail Haniya. That's a possibility, but it remains to be seen. And Khaled Mashal. Khaled Mashal was actually the first Hamas leader who visited at the time Moscow and met with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in 2006 when they won the elections. So he was a common guest in Moscow during the last few years. So these are the figures. In any case, those are the Hamas leaders who reside in Qatar mostly. And they are able to travel still. They feel protected enough. They are not afraid to do this kind of travel. So they might lead this Hamas delegation.
And say there actually is some kind of agreement reached between the PLO leadership, Abu Mazen, and the Hamas leadership. Would it be binding on Hamas that's in Gaza right now? Or are they ideologically independent by this point?
Well, we also do not see any flexibility or moderation on the behalf of the Hamas that resides outside. It's not that we have the more moderates who are sitting in Qatar and the more extreme ones, they are in Gaza. So sometimes it's just the opposite. Hamas inside experience all of the hardship of the wars, and sometimes rarely so, but they do examine some kind of pragmatism, different approach, whereas for Hamas in Qatar, well, they have a twisted perception of what is happening on the battlefield. And again, it's very unlikely that they will be agreeing to some kind of compromise that would undermine them ideologically, which is what they wage during all of these years, since the day of the initiation. And also now, after the 10-7, it's the continuing of the waging of they call it resistance, we call it terrorism, against Israel and inability to accept any kind of state of Israel. So it means basically the agreement to join the ranks of PLO and be binded by the previous agreements, impossible. So I will also have to remind our listeners that Hamas and Fatah, during these 17 years, they already signed many memorandums of understanding and agreements. There were hugs, there were kisses, there were signatures. The only thing that was lacking there is an actual implementation of these agreements.
At the same time, were Hamas to compromise with PLO, Hamas itself may survive. And then let's talk about, of course, the Biden doctrine, the idea of a Palestinian state imposed in the Gaza Strip and areas of the West Bank, maybe all of the West Bank, that, of course, our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu disagrees with firmly, to put in simple terms. But if they were to align their forces, Hamas and PLO, it seems as though, in a way, Russia and the United States is working together for the same goal. Would you agree?
I think that the goal might be similar, but at the same time, the means are very different. And also perhaps the outcomes could be different, because as for the position of the United States, Hamas should not be part of any political equation in the future Palestinian autonomy and in regards to the leadership in Gaza, of course, and so on. So this kind of a solution maybe it was possible before 10/7. And again, it was simply theoretical because we saw that they were not able to reach anything. But right now, and when we are talking about the, Russian position, they see Hamas as legitimate player. They do not recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization. But according to the American law, and we are talking about sanctions that were introduced against the Hamas, and so on, it is a terrorist organization, and they didn't cease to become one. So what kind of agreement, even if it theoretically will assume that it can be reached, I personally think that it can't, at least not one that can be really respected by both sides. This is something that will be respected by Russia, but it will not be respected by the United States or Israel.
Let's turn our focus slightly to other areas in the Middle East where Russia is still active. Or is it still active? Last year when we were speaking, we were talking about a pullout from Syria, for example. Has Russia pulled out in any way from the region?
Not only that the Russians, they are there, but they also, they also threaten Israel from Syria more than they did last year because of the deterioration of relations and because of the intensified Israeli military operations in Syria. So in regards to the assassination against the Iranian generals of the corpses of the Islamic Revolution, after that, there was unprecedented Russian response that indicated that on their willingness basically to protect the Iranians. And this is very serious development. They are both of them pariah states. They have nothing to lose out of these partnerships. And if we are talking about the size of the populations, 80 million of Iran, 140 million, more or less, Russia, military complex, common goals, so then I think that it's quite clear that they will cooperate still in Syria. They will continue doing so. I also always believe that despite tiny disagreements here and there, they have the same goal, protection of the regime of Bashar Assad that allows both of them to stay there. Some other regime, if it will be a Sunni-dominated regime, that will be closer to Turkey and so on, will not agree to that. Bashar Assad depends on them for their survival. So therefore, they would do everything to make him stay.
Where else are they active in the Middle East right now?
Places where Russia gained a lot of leverage during the last year, it's less the Arab Middle East, it's African countries. With very little force and little investment, they are taking over this very critical space in the Sahel area. And, something that is perhaps less successful, something that they did plan to advance, it's the relations with the Arab Gulf countries, such as Saudi Arabia and UAE. On one hand, we saw a lot of diplomatic activities. We saw Russian officials traveling there, and we saw the leaders of this country, some of them traveling to Russia. And we also saw that some of these countries, they increased their cooperation, economic cooperation with Russia.
As you're speaking, I'm just imagining a risk game board, this game Risk, and it just seems like the colors of the little pieces are changing throughout every single continent. And so I'm wondering now about Asia as well, and what's happening between Russia and, for example, China.
So I think China was a big disappointment. In general, Asia was a big disappointment to the Russians. The problem is that, of course, the Chinese, they are no, suckers in this regard. So if they want to buy Russian oil, they will do it, but for very low price. They will get unbelievable discounts. And then as a result, if you're looking at the bottom line, so yes, the Russians did sell their oil. What did they gain? Barely the costs of the production, and sometimes even less though. So then, yes, of course, it's not as practical as they thought. The other thing is, of course, the fear of the Western sanctions. So we see that this movement in the BRICS bloc, to which also Arab countries joined, there is some discussion of creating different perhaps orientiers, financial orientiers, and to be less dependent on the dollar. Many countries in this bloc are interested in this, but for now they are unable to basically they make this divide between themselves and the global markets that are still dominated by dollars and euros. And Russia tried to buy yuans. It was a miserable mistake because we see that the markets in China are going down at this very second. It was not profitable. It was not smart. The same is with rupee, with Indian rupee, so they found out quickly that it's no substitute. It's no substitute for their reliable partners from the European Union's prices, shipping, availability, And again, the reluctance also of Asian clients to work with Russian banks because they don't want to be sanctioned. So China trades with the United States and with Europe. Why would they want on earth for their banks to be sanctioned, by the secondary sanctions? And we see that all of the packages that are being confirmed by the EU recently and the United States, all of these packages, they are aimed at the battle against the trying to get away from the sanctions of the Russian getaway. So Turkey, UAE, other countries who perhaps in the beginning were interested and they thought that it's not risky because we are not talking about some military supplies after all and so on. But now they found that it's more and more difficult and Russians are finding it as well. So the relations are seemingly good, but in this duo, China and Russia, if the Russians thought maybe, that they would be the leading voice, then no, the Chinese would definitely not agree to this, idea of a leading Russian role. If anything, China wants to lead. And if you are talking about Indian-Russian relations, again, India, it's again a superpower, very significant one. Then we see growing alliance between the United States and India. And yes, although India belongs to the BRICS bloc, but its orientation, traditionally it was one of the non-allied countries and so on, it's moving further away and it's moving closer to the Western shores.
So let's talk about the feeling in Russia itself among Russians. Obviously, last week we heard of the death of Alexei Navalny. And I wonder how much this is affecting the people, the simple citizen, this death, as well as all the hardship, the economic hardship that you're describing.
Well, it really much depends on where you live and who you are. What do you do? If you are not going to protest for the freedom of political prisoners, if you will not protest against the war and you live in the centers of the big cities, which are Moscow, St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, you might be fine because all in all, Russia is still capable to protect the life and the level of life of its middle class, upper middle class, specifically less middle class, more the upper middle class and up. And the cities looks beautiful. I saw the photos of my friends who recently visited and they say, well, you do not see much difference if you are not from there. If you are local, then you will see because the prices are going up from 35 to 70% on the food staples and cosmetics and medicine and other things. Again, not to the degree that the ordinary Russian would say, oh, my life is impossible. I have to go out and protest no matter what. No, we are not there. No, it has to be very clear. You still can have more or less comfortable life, of course, if you are not extremely poor. But on the other hand, there is among those who perhaps were a little bit apathic in the beginning of the war, said, oh, this is again something that happens. After all, the war started not in 2022. It began in 2014. And many Russians were oblivious or even very happy about it, because they said, it's taking back Crimea. Crimea, it's the place of our youth. We all remember it, and it's a beautiful place, so why not? If we don't have to pay the price. Now they do pay the price. And one of the things that drew my attention that happened after Navalny's death, it's the report on the growing numbers of suicides. The understanding that there is no hope, that things are not great right now, and they will be, possibly becoming even more dangerous, sour, and so on. The picture here is very complex, because you see that there is no lack of those young men who would want to fight, and they are not drafted. There was no another, extraordinary draft. So actually, right now there is this feeling that the economy is doing bad. But there are some opportunities. Some people left to the West, so there is vacancies that have to be filled in IT specifically and so on. I see the ads for IT people all the time, and Russia, of course, trying to present this picture to the world that we are doing fine. You were not able to crush us. We are not dissolving. We are not falling down. And this is right. They are not falling. The regime is not falling. But you know what? It was also not the expected result of the sanctions. We know from everything that we know about the sanctions that they crumble, they can weaken the regime, but they do not cause him to fall. Look at the Iranians, look at the North Koreans, at Muammar Gaddafi, who lasted quite a long time with the sanctions. And so, but what is important, what I think the sanctions did achieve, additional pressure on the Russian military machine. They are unable to produce some of the military production, some of the weapons, because they are lacking parts that they are not able to produce by themselves. And they found out that, this seemingly divide in the world and the willingness of some countries to help them avoid the sanctions on, it's not as easy as they thought. So there is an extra strain on Russian economy. Eventually, perhaps less money to the war with Ukraine.
Ksenia, thank you so much for all of your insights.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
This What Matters Now was recorded in the Times of Israel's Jerusalem office, and unfortunately, I was the sound technician. So my apologies to Ksenia, whom I've adored and learned from for some 20 years and 20 more to come at least. Thankfully, it was also edited and produced by the Podwaves' Gilad Brownstein, who really saved the day here. If you have any comments or questions about this or any other What Matters Now, please send us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.